Um, I think we'll get started now. Presumably, some other people will join us. But anyway, thanks all of you who've come for this Labour Studies seminar. The Labour Studies seminar series is hosted by the Neil Agate Labour Studies Unit at Rhodes University in the Eastern Cape, South Africa. And when we talk about labour studies, we mean it in quite a broad sense. It can be studies of work, the workplace, labour markets, political economy, and of course, labour movements. And part of that is also the history of labour itself, labour history. So it's an absolute pleasure to have Peter Cole here, and I'll introduce him in a moment. I'd also like to encourage people, if you haven't done so, you can just send a message in the message channel. If you want to sign up for future notifications, you could either send a number and we'll share on WhatsApp, or you could send an email and we'll share that way. Peter Cole is going to be talking about really quite an important and often forgotten history of workers' internationalism. Very often these ideas around working class internationalism are thought about in a very abstract way, in a way where people think, well, this would be a good idea, but it's something that really has happened and really has been meaningful, and it's a really important part of the story of labour. Peter's topic is entitled Dockworker Battles on the Global Waterfront: Unions, Boycotts, and Mary Louise Hooper Against Apartheid. Let me just introduce Peter, and then Peter will take it away from here. Peter Cole is Professor of History at Western Illinois University in the United States. He's Research Associate at the Society Work and Development Institute, or SWOP, at the University of the Waterfront. He writes on contemporary politics, especially labor, race, and social movements. His books include Wobblies on the Waterfront, Interracial Unionism in Progressive Area Philadelphia, and the award-winning Dockworker Power, Race and Activism in Durban and San Francisco. And I think this broad scope of Peter's work, looking at workers, their struggles, their solidarities, and their global connections, is also shown in a book he co-edited with David Struthers and Kenyon Zimmer, which is Wobblies of the World, A Global History of the IWW, which was a radical syndicalist union. Ben Fletcher, The Life and Times of a Black Wobbly, about a key African-American leader of that syndicalist union. And an autobiography, I think, which was written by Herb Mills, called Presente, A Dockworker Story, which Peter helped bring to press and did a lot of editing on. So Peter, the floor is yours. The format will be you can present. I think we spoke about 35, 40 minutes, and then we'll take a few questions and open up a bit of a discussion there. So without further ado, Peter, I will recuse and hand it to you.
Thank you so much, Lucian. Thanks for inviting me to present at the Neil Agate Labor Studies seminar. Thanks also to Valence for your help with this. I'm only sorry I can't present in person since I'm talking to you from outside of South Africa. I am proud of my work that I've done before this, and so I appreciate Lucian naming some of my books. I did, though, want to mention that the book called Presente, A Dockworker Story, is actually a novel written by a dockworker, although it's really a lightly fictionalized memoir, which I did edit after he passed away and made sure it got published as I had promised him. And that book is available by ebook, right? And so even if you happen to be in South Africa, you could read that one pretty easily. Anyway, I'm here to talk with you about another history of dockworkers, and I'm going to share my screen and talk about that right now. All right, I believe everything looks as it's supposed to. So like Lucian mentioned, this topic is a component of the subject of internationalism, labor or worker internationalism. Dockworker battles on the global waterfront, unions, boycotts, and Mary Louise Hooper against apartheid. So in late 1962 in San Francisco, California, on the west coast of the United States, a typically gray and rainy early morning, a small group of people, mostly Black, but led by a white woman named Mary Louise Hooper, created a picket line, pictured here, in December of 1962. Mary Louise Hooper is the woman wearing the trench coat, rain hat, and sneakers, holding a sign that says, ILWU, please don't handle this South African cargo. She was joined by a group of mostly middle-aged activists in various civil rights organizations in the San Francisco Bay Area, including from the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which NAACP, and Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, right? And so these 20 or so people throw up a picket line requesting that dock workers don't work a ship called the Rocky, which arrived the night before. This ship was a Dutch ship from the Ned Lloyd Kimberley line, the Ned Lloyd line. And this ship was carrying cargo from South Africa. When this small group of people put together this small picket line on a pier in the city of San Francisco, there was approximately 100 men, black and white, who were dock workers, or in the United States often called longshoremen, who had been sent to this pier to unload this ship. However, as designed between Mary Louise Hooper and the black man pictured on the bottom left, Bill Chester, who is a union leader in the ILWU, those large group of men who could easily have walked across this picket line, instead respected this picket line, refused to sort of cross this picket line, and therefore refused to unload that ship that morning, as well as for the evening ship. So for 24 hours, this Dutch ship with South African cargo remained unworked in the harbor until it was the next day. This would be, in a way, the first worker action in the United States in solidarity with the struggle against apartheid, but not the last one. I'm going to talk to you about that subject. Specifically about Mary Louise Hooper and her partnership with Bill Chester and others in the International Longshoremen and Warehousemen's Union, ILWU. I'm also going to talk about a similar action that happened 10 months later in Brooklyn, in New York, where Hooper, along with others who were part of the organization she was a member of, the American Committee on Africa, or ACOA, to also refuse to unload a South African vessel to protest apartheid. I'm going to talk about those two topics, but I'm also going to talk about how other dock workers in the same era, the early 1960s, played an important role in the early chapter of the global struggle against apartheid. Even though these actions are pretty impressive and were happening in ports across the world, including Australia, New Zealand, Denmark, Trinidad, and other places, they weren't repeated. So even though Hooper and the American Committee on Africa had some remarkable success in 62 and 63, they pivoted and started to do other things as far as sort of protesting apartheid, right? It would not be until the late 1970s, actually, that dock workers started to engage in similar activism. Workers who were part of the struggle against apartheid outside of South Africa, in the United States, but also in other countries, is a subject that continues to sort of be understudied and underappreciated, I would suggest. Instead, that other aspects of the global movement against apartheid have received a lot more attention, including particularly student activism or activism on universities and religious groups that were involved in the struggle. In addition, many people, including me, who have written about the anti-apartheid movement, have more typically written about it in the later era, in the post-Soweto era and in the 1980s. I should note that in South Africa, dockers and other workers were very important in the struggle going back from the 50s onward, right? And that in South Africa, I think that basically historians have a greater appreciation for how workers played an important role in the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, but less so in the movement in solidarity with anti-apartheid outside of the country. Yeah. So some thoughts on how would we describe these sorts of actions? Two different groups or ideas that sort of come to mind for me. One is called labor internationalism, another is called Black internationalism. Labor internationalism, as defined here by Marcel van der Linden, is basically saying that when workers act on behalf of workers in another country in ways to support workers in that other country, yet might in fact sacrifice their own material interests, at least in the short term, that's an example of some sort of sacrifice on behalf of people in another country. And that is motivated by a sort of an internationalist perspective, that we share something in common and therefore we should support each other, even if we've never met before, even if you live in another country, right? And even if it actually might hurt me in some way, at least in the short term. For example, when those dock workers refused to work in San Francisco in 1962, they didn't get paid that day. Right. And say they literally took money out of their pockets. They took money out of their families' mouths in order to support workers in South Africa. Now, another ideology that is not necessarily in contradiction, often they work in tandem, but they are somewhat separate, is this notion of Black internationalism, which is a more common term, I think, at least in the US nowadays. But I think it's fair to also substitute the term Pan-Africanism to describe this, which is that people who identify as Black, both in Africa, but also in the diaspora, those of African descent, particularly in the Atlantic world, who were part of the transatlantic slave trade in the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, right? Like share some sort of common identity, political, cultural, ideological, intellectual, right? And that they also share common enemy. In the case, I'm referring to white supremacy, right? And so therefore, share common interests and therefore should act in solidarity with each other. Probably the best known person who promoted these ideas was Marcus Garvey, right? The Jamaican who lived for much of his activist era in New York City, in Harlem, but who sort of often agitated and spoke on behalf of Africans, both in Africa, but also in the diaspora, including himself. Yeah, so these are sort of the intellectual frameworks under which why do workers act as they do in these stories that I'm telling you today. Yeah. Now, Mary Louise Hooper is an interesting character who actually brings different politics to the table, somewhat shared goals, but different trajectory to get there, right? Mary Louise Hooper, the white woman pictured in between Albert Lutuli on the left and another South African, presumably, on the right. So Mary Louise Hooper, I'll talk to you about more, but basically, this is a white woman born in the 19 teens who was born into an incredibly wealthy family. And when I say incredibly wealthy, that's probably underestimating it. If you adjust for inflation, her father was a billionaire, right? And Mary Louise Hooper, therefore, was the daughter of not just wealth, but tremendous wealth. Even though that's the case, her mother in particular raised her to be incredibly sympathetic to those less fortunate, the poor, but also not just in the United States, but around the world. And so her mother's politics really come from her sort of Christian, her Church of Nazarene background. Hooper was raised in that too. She traveled a lot with her mother as a child and was shown not just sort of comfort, but also poverty and that she should help. As an adult, she actually converted to Quakerism, but retained a lot of those religious values, right? Very much anti-poverty, very much internationalist, traveled a great deal, especially starting as an adult in Africa. But even before she was sort of engaged in and lived in and worked on South Africa, she'd become active in the civil rights movement in the United States to fight for racial equality within the United States, including, but not only with the NAACP. She was actually married 3 times. Her third husband's name was Hooper, and that's the name that we know her by, Mary Louise Hooper. It is worth noting that she met her third husband, who was also an activist in the NAACP, but happened to be African American. So she married a Black man, right? She couldn't marry a Black man in California in the 1940s. It was illegal, but she could marry in the state of Washington. So she and her husband got married in Seattle. The marriage didn't last so long, but she kept his name. That's sort of interesting. Soon after she divorced, she actually went back to college in her 40s, went to Stanford University, which is an elite, generally excellent university, finished at the top of her class, was nominated for what's called Phi Beta Kappa, which is this elite honor society, and then traveled to South Africa, not for the first time to Africa. And then she ended up living in Durban for, well, we're not entirely sure, 1 to 2 years in the mid-1950s. She also traveled extensively in many other countries in Africa, including colonies that were fighting for liberation. She was expelled from South Africa in 1957 because of her friendship with, and support for Luthuli and the ANC, right? But she represented the ANC. As far as we know, she's the only person who attended all three all African People's Congresses in Africa in the late 50s and 1960s. She's the only one who represented all 3 times the ANC. And she's also the only white person who was, as far as we know, in the ANC in that era. This is actually before white South Africans were in the ANC. When she was expelled from South Africa, she returned to the San Francisco Bay Area, which became her home again for many years, right? And a few years later is when she led the action that I began my presentation with. But it is important to know that for her, like many other Americans who were involved in the anti-apartheid movement, they saw this as part of a global struggle against racism. In other words, that she had a somewhat of a Black internationalist perspective. And that's why she said the freedom struggle is the same in Mississippi or South Africa, Mississippi being a state, in some cases, the most racist state, perhaps in the United States in the 1950s and 1960s. So what sort of tactics did Hooper use? Well, Hooper and other anti-apartheid activists use a variety of tactics, but I'm highlighting worker actions, which I generally use the word boycott, not strike. If people want to talk about that, we could do that. But boycotts where you refuse to work certain cargo or certain days or certain businesses because you don't support the politics, right? There's a long history of workers using boycotts, although I do think that actually more of us think about consumers when we think about boycotts. Some consumer boycotts are actually on behalf of worker struggles, right? So, you know, I don't know, I'm a vegan, right? I guess you could say I boycott meat products because I choose to sort of not eat meat. But in the United States, for example, in the 1960s and 1970s, farm workers who were unionizing called upon American consumers to not purchase table grapes because the big owners of these big farms in California refused to negotiate with the United Farm Workers of America. And so there was a great boycott. That photograph or poster on the right is an example of a consumer boycott on behalf of workers. So too, the image of a poster on the left, Coors beer is a popular beer in the United States. It's sort of like a Castle, right, in South Africa. And because Coors refused to negotiate with some of its workers who were unionized, and Coors workers went on strike, there was a huge effort to boycott Coors beer in a number of different places, right? So don't buy Coors, right? Of course, the poster in the middle comes from the anti-apartheid movement, where in the 60s, but then growing into the 70s and 80s, a growing number of people advocated for boycotting South African products like citrus fruit, for example. This poster is interesting because it was produced by the International Confederation of Free Trade Unions, ICFTU, because that was a conglomeration of unions from many countries in the West, so-called West, aligned with the United States in the Cold War against the Soviet Union. And so there was a rival labor federation called the World Federation of Trade Unions, which was sort of aligned with the Soviet Union, right? And so here we have a poster actually of the sort of the mainstream labor federation representing tens of millions of workers, really probably hundreds of millions of workers in the 1950s and 60s, advocating for a consumer boycott, right? So workers advocating for a consumer boycott, right? Why do we see these boycotts emerging? So early 1960s, Sharpeville Massacre. And after the Sharpeville Massacre, there's sort of growing sort of organization against apartheid, but also growing awareness globally about the horrors of apartheid, so that the African National Congress started to call for boycotts. The American Committee on Africa, which was small, but was the most important organization in the US, fighting against apartheid, but also for African freedom across the continent, right? But also unions increasingly started to turn to or considered turning to boycotts as a strategy to pressurize the South African state to abandon apartheid. So it was right after Sharpeville that ANC endorsed worker boycotts, right? What would be the counter argument to not having boycotts? Well, some people, especially those associated with big businesses, would say, well, if we don't buy South African products, then South African workers will suffer the consequences, right, of that because they'll sell less products and therefore maybe there's going to be fewer workers in South Africa. Nevertheless, ANC, which was at that time the largest and most influential anti-apartheid organization, starts to adopt this call for boycotts, including its president, Albert Lutuli, who was, in the same moment about to be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Calls on boycotts too. Economic boycott is one way in which the world at large can bring home to South African authorities that they must either mend their ways or suffer from them. The ACOA, following the lead of the ANC, very possibly because of Hooper's influence in the ACOA, although it also was a mainstream accepted idea, call on the U.S. consumers to start boycotting South African goods, but also for the U.S. government to pass a law to basically ban trade with South Africa. That would not happen until actually 1986. Now, why dock workers specifically? Well, dock workers are arguably one of the more important group of workers in the world because they are what we now refer to as at choke points, which is to say they work in logistics or ship or transportation. And the argument is that basically the chain or the supply chain is only as strong as its weakest link. If you want to flip that around and say instead of a weak link, you might have say where workers are strong enough to break the chain, right? And so when workers are organized, at one point in the chain, they could potentially break the entire chain, right? Now, the logic of this is that wherever workers are organized on the supply chain, dock workers are not unique, is actually an important point. Workers in other sectors of the supply chain, for example, on ships, on trucks, on rail, right, in warehouses, they're also part of the supply chain. If they were also equally well organized, they too could advocate for and protest against any number of issues by refusing to work. Now, in this early 1960s era, the ICFTU, which I named already as being this federation of unions across Western Europe, Latin America, and the United States, North America, the ICFTU considered boycotts, but decided against endorsing them, in part because many maritime unions, which were affiliated with the International Transport Workers Federation, ITF, basically said, oh, we don't want to call these boycotts, right? And so the ICFTU, if you will, followed the lead of the sector, transport workers, and the transport worker leaders, which is based in London, opposed the use of boycotts. Why? Well, they thought it would be complicated, or maybe a lot of their unions didn't consider it to be that important an issue, right? No doubt there's a variety of reasons. However, some maritime unions that were more radical, including the West Coast Dock Workers of the United States, the ILWU, but also other examples being the Waterside Workers of Australia, Federation of Australia, the wharfies in Sydney, Melbourne, and other places, also rejected that and occasionally engage in boycotts, regardless of the fact that these main federations failed to do so. I'm going to talk about some of that. So in 1960, just a few months after Sharpeville, dock workers in a number of countries started to refuse to touch South African cargo. One of the first examples was in the port of Spain, which is the big port city in Trinidad in the Caribbean, close to Venezuela, most of whose workers and working class are African descended, although there's also many South Asians in Trinidad being a former British possession. So basically black folks and South Asian folks, right? but most of the dock workers were Black. And it is noteworthy, again, thinking about this Black internationalism stuff, right, that it was Trinidadian dockers who refused on multiple occasions to touch South African cargo, right? That was very important. And it's also of interest to me, right, and further proof that what newspapers cover this story even. Well, it was a Black newspaper in Jackson, Mississippi, which was the capital of Mississippi, that covers this. Same year, around the same time, dock workers in both New Zealand and Australia also refused to handle South African cargo. Both Australia and New Zealand also were former British colonies. And as is appreciated, I think, in South Africa, there's a lot of connections of various sorts, economic, cultural, demographic, and other, between Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, right? So it was both dock workers, but also sailors or seamen who engaged in anti-apartheid activism in the 1960s. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Mary Louise Hooper actually lived in Durban, South Africa for 1 or 2 years, around 1955 to 1957. Anyone who spends any time in Durban, but also especially those who are interested in the political situation, cannot help but appreciate the centrality of the port to the city. Right. It is sort of physically at the heart of the city, the harbor and the point, but also it's the most important industry. Anyone who reads the newspaper, which at that time the major white newspaper was the Mercury, would read about the harbor. It was covered all the time, all the port business. Anytime dock workers went on strike, right, it was page 1 of the Mercury. Right. And so, just as I, as a historian, read old Mercuries, I can only assume that Hooper would have seen these sorts of things, although we have no direct evidence that she was paying close attention to the port of Durban when she lived in Durban. She almost certainly would not have known that 20 years earlier, in 1935, Durban dockers refused to load food, frozen meat aboard an Italian ship soon after the Italian army invaded Ethiopia. And so just as dockers in Trinidad refused to handle South African cargo, dockers in Durban, some of them might have been even in this photograph, refused to work a ship because of their sympathy with Ethiopians who were victims of Italian military aggression, right? I don't think that Hooper knew this story, but it is noteworthy, and it's the first known example in South Africa of this sort of activism. However, we do know, and I've written a lot about Durban dockers who repeatedly down their tools in the 40s, 50s, and beyond, mostly to get a raise. Now, dockers in Durban, but also in other South African ports like Port Elizabeth, didn't have permanent jobs. They were so-called casual workers, which meant that you didn't have a job. You had to go to the docks and hope to get hired for that day. If, however, you don't report for work because you don't feel like it, because you're sick, because you're hungover, because you just would like to take off, you could do that, right? There's no one preventing you from not showing up for work because you actually have no job. Now, if one person doesn't show up for work, it's no big deal. But if all the dockers coordinate a stay away, right, then it is the same effect as a strike, even though Black workers in that era did not have the legal right to strike or to unionize. And so we know that this was happening. There's all sorts of evidence suggesting that this is giving employers headaches in the 40s and 50s. We also know that this strategy was also used in Port Elizabeth and probably other ports, right? Now, again, although we have no direct way to tie Hooper to these actions, I am almost certain that Hooper would have been living in Durban in 1956, and one of the big strikes that Durban dockers do pull off actually is that same year, and that would have been covered in the Mercury. Appreciating that Rhodes University is in Eastern Cape, and also that Port Elizabeth is much closer than Durban, and also because a wonderful woman named Nebakazi Makwetu got her master's at Rhodes in the Labor Studies program, right? And who is now getting her PhD at Fort Hare, writing a biography of the history of Vuyisile Mini, pictured here. I can't help but sort of invoke him briefly, right? Minnie is best known, no doubt, for the songs he wrote, including the one "Watch Out, Verwoerd," that's featured below. But it also is crucial to understand that he was a leader in his union. That union was dockworkers. His father had also been a dockworker. Although he was born in the rural Eastern Cape in the Transkei, he had moved, like his father before him, to PE, where he worked, where he became active in his union, where he also became active in the ANC and MK. And along the way, of course, was writing songs. And of course, he was executed really for his songwriting. But it is not insignificant that his entree into the world of activism was on the waterfront in Port Elizabeth. Back in Durban, which was and remains the largest port in South Africa, dockers by the late 50s engaged in a series of actions, 58 and 59, in coordination with the South African Congress of Trade Unions, SACTU. And SAC2 is basically encouraging transport workers to stay away in exchange for significant wage raises. But I also want to highlight that what's happening in Durban, what's happening in Port Elizabeth, is happening in other African port cities. So on the East African coast in Mombasa in British East Africa, dockers repeatedly go on strike in the 40s and 50s. A lot of that is covered in the work of the historian Frederick Cooper. But also on the west coast of Africa, for example, in Portuguese Africa and Guinea-Bissau, dockers go on strike and are mowed down by Portuguese soldiers, right, in 1959 in a massacre. And so I'm pointing out that in Durban, but also in Mombasa and also in Guinea-Bissau, what we see is similar activism, that transport workers have particularly well organized, have the ability to basically really hit hard the sort of power structures economy through transportation, whether it's rail or ship. And so therefore what we see is Durban is a part of larger struggles, right? Like back in the United States, let me highlight the work of the International Longshore Men's and Warehouse Men's Union, ILWU. Although in 1997, they degendered their name. Up until then, those genders were in longshoremen and warehousemen. Led by an Australian immigrant pictured here named Harry Bridges. In 1934, this union was born out of a huge strike that affected every single port on the Pacific coast of the United States. This union was born. They won their first contract. They forced employers to give raises, to reduce hours, and to do a whole lot more. And in the process, this union became mighty and strong. The ILWU was led by Bridges, but also there were many left-wing members and leaders in the ILWU. But Bridges was well known for being an anti-capitalist and there were communists, there were Wobblies, there were Trotskyists, and many others in it. How do we know what the LW is doing and how were their politics impacting the union? Well, when they won the coastwide contract, they got rid of the casual labor system that exploited workers through forcing them to compete with each other for work. Instead, employers had to call the union hall. Union members elected their own dispatchers every year. Dispatchers decided who was going to go to work that day, and they decided based on whoever had the least amount of work in that part of the year, which was called low man out. In other words, the workers who would earn the least amount of money, if they showed up for work at the union hall that day, they would be sent first to get those ships, right? And so this is an example of radical egalitarianism, I would say, and very rare, but also evidence of their sort of socialism in practice. This union was also, for the same reasons, anti-racist, even though it was literally 99% white when founded in the 1930s. Starting in World War II, a significant number of African Americans entered the union, including the man pictured on the top, Cleophas Williams, who I got to know late in his life, who moved from rural Arkansas to Oakland. And to Williams and many other Black people, this is the first time they had been treated equally by white people. And in his own words, many felt that the union was a utopia. Right. And that was because many of these white socialists believed in racial equality because they believed that race was often used as a wedge to weaken and divide the working class. So it's in that context that we get back to what I began with, right? That Bill Chester, pictured on the left, coordinating with Mary Louise Hooper, the white woman pictured on the right, refused to work a ship loaded with South African cargo in order to protest against apartheid. Right. And so what we have example of is like a union coordinating with civil society groups on civil rights and African liberation in order to sort of engage in direct action on the job. Right. First time in the history of the United States that this happened, one of the first in the world. The story was picked up by a great many newspapers across the United States because it was covered in what's called the Associated Press, which basically provides news for lots of smaller newspapers that don't have the capacity to cover everything everywhere. And so I should note that Donald Trump has gone to war against the Associated Press, but nevertheless, the AP is actually an example of a useful media source because it is both non-for-profit, but also sort of provides sort of news, right? Not editorial news from around the country and world, right? And so this story was covered in a lot of newspapers locally, but also across the United States, including this picture from a newspaper in a small town in Indiana where Mary Louise Hooper is in the middle of the three people protesting there. The following year, this action was so successful. Dock workers, coordinating with the ACOA, basically say, "Can we do this again?" Right. And so starting in early 1963 in New York City, which was the largest port in the country at that time still, and where the American Committee on Africa was based, led by a man named George Hauser, the white man pictured on the bottom right, coordinating with a close friend of his named James Farmer, the black man pictured to his left, who was the head of CORE, which was the Congress of Racial Equality, and Farmer was one of the most important civil rights activists. Hauser and Farmer were longtime friends. They had started working together in the early 40s. They were pacifists and actually had opposed the U.S. war in World War II. They also were radical anti-racists who had been arrested on multiple occasions to protest racial segregation in the North. They bring in a bunch of other people from the ACOA, including the white man holding a sign on the upper left, whose name was Jim Peck. He was a civil rights activist and a pacifist who was one of the Freedom Riders in 1961 in Mississippi, who was nearly beaten to death for riding in an interracial bus, right? They coordinate with a local branch of the East Coast Dock Workers Union, which is called the International Longshore Men's Association, or ILA. In Brooklyn, the local was 1814 and led by a man named Anthony Scotto, who's wearing a suit in the upper right corner, right? They basically do something similar to what had been done in San Francisco, right? A ship comes in, but rather than a Dutch ship carrying South African cargo, a South African-owned vessel carrying South African cargo, not the vessel in that photograph, right, comes in, and then the ILA refuses to work that ship, right, similar to what had happened in San Francisco 10 months earlier, right? And so this was an ACOA core ILA action as opposed to an ILWU ACLA core action. Why did the ILA engage in this sort of activism? For those who are unaware, and I assume that all of you are, the LWU is this left-wing, interracial, anti-racist union. It had broken away from the East Coast, New York City-dominated ILA in the 1930s, right? Scotto wasn't born in the 30s, but he's sort of a up-and-coming labor leader in that union in the 1960s. Why does the ILA agree to this? I wish I had a great answer. There's no other examples of the ILA engaging in this sort of progressive transnational solidarity activism, period, right? We know the ILA didn't engage in another such action. We know that the ILA supposedly, according to reports from Scotto and the ACOA, took a lot of pressure to not do this, but did it anyway. It's not clear if he was coordinated with the membership or basically told the members what to do, because it's very well known that the ILA, in fact, is an anti-democratic union. Its leaders control from the top. There are often many locals that don't have regular meetings. There's been the long history of the use of violence up to and including murder to sort of kill reformers inside the union, including in Brooklyn, where Scotto is based. In the 30 years earlier, approximately, a Brooklyn Italian dock worker named Pete Panna was murdered, presumably by ILA thugs, because he was agitating to democratize the ILA. We also know the ILA was racially segregated in many of its locals, and that there are close ties with the mafia, with organized crime in New York City especially, right? And so the ILA has a totally different profile than the LWU. They both engage in actions of a similar sort within a 12-month span in 1962-63. We also know that Scotto later went to prison for many years for racketeering and other charges, right? So it's somewhat of a mystery, but it's fascinating, right? And important that the ACOA was able to work with the ILA, at least on that one occasion. Now, back to the west coast of the United States in 1984, right? Members of the San Francisco Bay Area local ILW Local 10 had created, after Soweto, a Southern Africa Liberation Support Committee. This was not the leadership imposing this upon the members. This was actually created by rank and file members, got the membership of the local to approve it, and then basically ran this committee for many years, educating its fellow workers in how to well, why to care about South Africa, why apartheid was horrible, and therefore that people should act. Now, in 1984, very rare and perhaps the first and only time, the committee got permission to show a documentary film at their monthly union meeting. And that film is Last Grave at Dimbaza, pictured here on the left. Now, I appreciate that I'm talking to an audience that's based in the Eastern Cape. You probably all know that Dimbaza is a township in the Eastern Cape. And that has actually, going back to the 60s when it was created, very desolate, right? And so I don't know if everyone's seen this film. If you haven't, I strongly encourage you to do so. It was created illegally, or I should say secretly, in the early 1970s by activists. It's not only about Dimbaza, it's about apartheid. And after you watch this 1 hour film, which ends with a segment on Dimbaza, then most people come to appreciate that apartheid was horrible, wrong, and should be overthrown. And so I encourage you to see this film, although it was hard to now see. It was used on thousands of occasions across the world as an educational tool to raise awareness outside of South Africa about why apartheid was an evil system. When this film was shown, as designed, it enraged the members. Then, as designed, a member of the union got up and said, "I make a motion, we refuse to work the next ship that comes in from with South African cargo." A second member amended the motion to say we should only not handle the South African cargo. In other words, if there's cargo from other countries, we unload that, but we just refuse to touch the South African cargo. And that's what passed almost unanimously. And this ship, the Ned Lloyd Kimberley, came in a few weeks later, right? And so began a 10-day action where the ship was not touched, as hundreds and hundreds and then thousands of people protested in solidarity with the union at the foot of the pier in San Francisco in November of 1984, just a few weeks after Ronald Reagan's landslide re-election. 6 years later, Nelson Mandela and other activists were freed from prison. The ANC, the PAC, and other political organizations that had been banned were unbanned. A few months later, Nelson Mandela took the first of numerous international tours to thank countries around the world for their support in the struggle. Nelson was then, of course, married still to Winnie. And so they did a 10-day tour of the United States of America that included 3 days in the San Francisco Bay Area. I should say 2 days in the San Francisco Bay Area. And so the final stop on their tour, Oakland, California, which is on the eastern side of a bay, San Francisco Bay from San Francisco. Nelson and Winnie Mandela spoke before a 60,000 person audience, and he spent 10% of his speech praising the union, the ILW Local 10, for their action in 1984. And being, in his words, the front line of the anti-apartheid movement in the Bay Area, right? The only group actually he singled out. If Mary Louise Hooper had been alive, she had passed away actually a few years earlier, she probably would have been helping to organize this tour in San Francisco Bay Area and probably would have whispered to Nelson Mandela, actually, this was not the first time that Local 10 engaged in this sort of action. 22 years earlier, they had done something similar, and I had helped. I would be remiss to not try to connect the past to the present overtly, even though I think it's often easy to do for each ourselves. But going back to the late 1980s, the same group of people in the Bay Area who were anti-apartheid South Africa began to start to condemn Israel for apartheid policies. That was the term they used in their international convention debate on whether or not they should condemn Israel and give support to the Palestinian freedom movement, which was passed and renewed in the 1990s. In the 2010s, an Israeli-owned shipping company named Zim, Z-I-M, docked in Oakland on multiple occasions, and coordinating with civil society groups led by Arab Americans, Local 10 members refused to cross these picket lines, similar to what they had done in 1962, to refuse to handle is Israeli-owned ship, right? This photograph from 2014. I am very mindful as an American, but also as a Jewish American, of what's happening in more recent times, including that there is incredible support for the Palestinian freedom movement in the United States, including among workers, including within the San Francisco Bay Area. However, the government, both the Biden administration, but also now the Trump administration, are brutally repressive to people who are sympathetic to Palestine and are weaponizing anti-Semitism in a way it is not unique to the United States, to basically condemn anyone who's critical of Israel and anyone who's sympathetic to the Palestinian cause. And so although dock workers in the Bay Area have expressed solidarity with Palestine, they haven't engaged in any direct actions, although it is worth noting that those ships probably would dock on the east coast of the United States, not the west coast. But even May Day, just a few days ago, Local 10's Young Worker Committee on Instagram posted this so that they too are very much interested in what's going on. They very much appreciate the history of their union, including the anti-apartheid activism. In fact, I've been with members of Local 10 in Durban to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Durban strikes. So in January of 2023, I was with 14 members of the LWU in Durban at a Durban Strikes 50 conference. And they're aware that, that they should be still engaged in these struggles today. Now, why do we do this? Of course, to quote one of my advisors from graduate school, Marcus Rediker, and his co-author, Peter Leinbach, it's because shipping is both an engine of capitalism and a setting of resistance. I love that quote, right? I've talked to you a little today about how dockers using their unions, and because they also have some structural power built into the industry, have engaged in direct action. And I also sort of mentioned that other workers have similar ability or potential, if they so wish. They might be engaged by labor internationalism, might be engaged by Black internationalism, might be sympathetic to people in another country, whether it's South Africa or Palestine. Mary Louise Hooper and the organization she was a long time an activist in partnered with unions in the early 60s, but actually subsequently didn't really fixate or focus on coordinating with workers, which was unfortunate. Other tactics and boycotts of other sectors was more common. For example, the sports boycott that actually was going very well in the 1960s when South Africa was banned from Olympics, and then later individual countries refused to start to play with the rugby Springboks, England, Australia, later New Zealand, right? Docker boycotts, however, really are not part of the conversation when we talk about the historiography. Hooper and the ACOA also aren't really discussed in these contexts. And I am suggesting that workers and unions are actually very important in the struggle, and that they should be centered more directly in these conversations. I again thank you for attending this presentation today. I very much appreciate your time and attention. I also very much appreciate the work that Lucian and Vasil and others are doing to sort of keep labor studies alive in the Eastern Cape. And if anyone wishes to ask questions or offer comments, it will be my pleasure to try to answer them. Thank you again.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks very much for that. What we normally do at this stage is we take a... Am I muted? Okay. What we normally do at this stage is take a couple of questions. So I just want to see who is got some burning question. You can either put up your hand or you can put something in the chat. I should also just mention that thanks, Peter, for giving a shout out for Last Grave to Dumbaza. I've put a link in the chat for a copy that seems to be on at YouTube. I can't verify it's completely complete there, but anyway. All right, so are there any questions? You can signal with a hand. And if you do say something, I think it'll be nice if you can just also introduce yourself. Anybody? All right. Okay, while people gather their thoughts, let me just maybe make a general comment. Peter, first, thanks very much for the talk. I think it highlights that trade unions are very often much more than simply about wage bargaining and working conditions, important as those are the core business. I mean, I see there's Comrade Zonakolo, sitting on the side there. He was in NUMSA for many years, a national educator, and before that, a veteran of unions. And I think it's always an important reminder that unions are often and can be much more than simply about wages, working conditions, and narrow interests. So it's really a remarkable story. I think also the thing about the hiring hall is very, very interesting. I mean, that's a sort of institution that organized labor promoted in a number of countries, which is almost completely being forgotten. It's a way of dealing with casual labor where the union itself controls the supply of labor, becomes a sort of, I don't want to say labor broker, it's got bad connotations, but it's a better arrangement for workers. So my question, Peter, while others are thinking about questions, I think we can probably see fairly easily why Trinidad, there'd be solidarity there, why ideas like Garveyism and so on, which had quite a big influence in South Africa and Southwest Africa and Zimbabwe in the 1920s, why those ideas could contribute to people coming out and strike in, say, Trinidad, that solidarity. How do we explain people coming out? And of course, the African-American connection is crucial in that context. But how do we explain, for example, Australian and New Zealand and Danish and Norwegian dockers coming out in boycotts or strikes and other solidarity actions for things happening in South Africa? What's going on there? So I'll put that there. Let's see, anybody else got some questions? Don't be shy. Be shy. So shy. Right, you'll maybe want to take that one in the meantime, Peter?
Of course. Well, I appreciate the question. I'll answer it as best as I'm able. I would say that I wonder, though, like, as far as our personal ideologies, what motivates more people? Like, is it our so-called racial identity or our political identity? Not that it has to be either or. Of course, it can be both and. So undeniably, there are Black workers in many countries across the 20th century, and I would even say the 19th century, right, when we're talking about really anti-slavery activism throughout the Atlantic world, right, like who agitate because they feel that they share something in common, meaningful. Like we are of the same group, right? African Americans, but not only African Americans, Jamaicans, Black people across the Americas who very much, even those who don't know what the word Pan-Africanism is, right, like often have expressed, and I've witnessed it on many occasions among my African American friends who express interest in support for Africa, offended when people like Donald Trump, insult African countries, but also very much identify, right? Like, and it is worth noting that African Americans don't know where they're from within Africa. And so the term African American is vague because they don't know if they're from what is now Nigeria or now Angola or any other place, right? So too people from Trinidad, right? Like, so too people from other sort of parts of the African diaspora, right? And so I do think I agree with you that that's one reason. And I failed to mention it, right? But by the 1960s, although I had mentioned that the union in San Francisco was had a large Black membership, by the late 60s, it was Black majority, right? It was actually the first Black majority local and still the only Black majority local in the Longshore division of the ILWU. It's very much known within the union. Whether that's a good or a bad thing, it depends on the individuals, right? Like that it's the Black local, right? Like they're also the long history of the activist local, right? Now that's partially due to that African Americans fighting for racial equality, but it's also originally due to the left-wing politics of the local's founders, right? Harry Bridges came out of that local to be elected president and remain president for 30 years or more, right? And so left internationalism, I used the term earlier, labor internationalism, but the left, which is to say socialism, big tent, right? Not just communists, but also all those who are influenced by Marx, right? All those who are critical of capitalism. There's a history going back to the really the late 19th century, but very much in the early 20th century of workers who were left-wing engaging in this sort of politics, right? Sometimes it's rhetorical, right? Like I am critical of this state because I don't like its politics. Less commonly does it engage in direct political or workplace activism, which of course is a much higher stakes than just speaking out, right? Like even though speaking out sometimes is even dangerous too, right? Like so in the early 1930s, for example, communist affiliated maritime workers, led by a Trinidadian named George Padmore, actually started to condemn, right, the Japanese invasion of China, right, as well as later the Italian invasion of Ethiopia, right. Those condemnations, while noteworthy and, in my opinion, accurate, right, didn't result in any direct actions. Right, like no workers actually took action. It was rhetorical. They wrote about it. They spoke about it. But starting in 1935, 36, as I mentioned, we start to see a few actions where, as I mentioned, Durban dockers refused to work an Italian ship to protest this invasion. I didn't mention, however, in San Francisco, which at that time was, when I say 99% white membership, that's not an exaggeration. There were a few dozen Black members out of a local that had over 1,000 members, right? They refused to work actually around May Day in 1936, and Italian ships that were docking in San Francisco, which was the busiest port, not just on the west coast of the US, was actually the busiest port on the Pacific coast of the Americas, right? And so we see that activism in 35, 36. Actually, this West Coast Dockworkers Union in the Bay Area, but also in Los Angeles and Seattle, same union, different ports, engage in coordinating with Chinese activists, protest against the Japanese invasion of China in 1938, 39, 40. And in San Francisco, led by a Japanese member who was an anti-Japanese imperialist, right, and a communist named Carl Yaneda, where they refused to work dozens of ships that were loading cargo for Japan because that cargo would go to, as the article that I will publish soon called "Scrap Iron Becomes Bullets," right? If the U.S. exports metal to Japan, that metal literally becomes bullets that kill Chinese people, right? And so that sort of activism, who sort of cares about that? Well, I would like to think that all of us would care about that, right? I would like to think that all of us don't want to see innocent people die. I know that a great many people believe in God, and that gods generally tell people that it is wrong to kill. But unfortunately, that hasn't usually resulted in people getting involved in a direct way to prevent mass killings, especially when a state's involved, right? Who is doing it? It's really left-wing activists, right? And so when I look at who are the people who are choosing to engage in actions that might result in them getting fired, as well as losing money, because those are direct sacrifices made by workers, admittedly short-term, right? It's people who self-identify as communists, socialists, syndicalists, right? Those are the people. So those are the two buckets. Now, of course, some of these left-wingers are Black themselves, right? And so it's not like it's either or. Some Blacks are also socialists, communists, etc. Right? But who are the white people who are engaging in solidarity activism with South Africa? It's the lefties, right? They are the ones who at least lead it. And that is also the case in Australia, because you also asked me not just about, but like, because the WWF in Australia, they call dockers wharfies, right? They were communist led from the 30s. Really, there was someone very much like Harry Bridges, and I mentioned that Bridges is Australian. So there's a very close relationship between the WWF and the LWU in the 30s, 40s, and 50s and 60s still, even though those unions have evolved and those leaders are passed away, right? Like, and they very much identify as, right, like anti-capitalist, right? Often critical in the Cold War era of U.S. foreign policy, U.S. war in Vietnam, many number of other sort of actions that are sort of interventionist, right? And so, not to say that the left is always on the quote unquote right side. It's easy to criticize Soviet invasion of Afghanistan or any number of other, right, things. But like, there is this clear evidence of who is engaging in activism, and we generally can. It's easier to identify the left activists than the Black activists. We could presume that why did those Trinidadians stop work? I don't have any direct quotes from Trinidadian dockers from 1960. I could guess. I could be wrong. I mean, I'm probably right. We're probably right. But, yeah.
Oh, thanks, man. That's very interesting. Let's see. Anyone else? Come on, let's get somebody else. Much as I'd love to talk all day, let's hear some other voice, other question. Can just even just be a question just for clarity. It doesn't have to be highfalutin. Um, anyone? Hmm. Yeah, anyone? Don't be shy.
Can I pose a question?
Yeah, fire away.
I'm curious what people think. If people think that this sort of worker activism is interesting, meaningful, important, right? Because some people would suggest that these are just symbolic actions that don't have any sort of real material significance, right? I would disagree, not surprisingly, but I sometimes get that question, but I wonder if anyone else has had those thoughts and wants to even make the counter argument, right?
So, Peter, while we wait for people there, I mean, let's bring it to the present, right? So, in the 1960s, you've got quite large workforces on the docks, whether it's dock labor in Durban or large groups of casual workers being coming into hiring halls in San Francisco and so on. But we've had a lot of containerization and mechanization going on at the docks, and now AI is also kicking in. How do you think this affects the power of dockers or wharfies or whatever the category may be in a particular country? Do you see this power still remaining important for this particular group of workers?
That's an important question. It's not unique to this industry, right? And so, how does technology affect worker power, right? I still actually am very curious to see if AI will be significant in any way in this particular industry, right? I would suggest that educators are far more at risk from AI than dock workers, right? But technology, specifically containerization that you named, was a game changer in the case of this industry, undeniably so, right? And so this technology or technological process, really, where you sort of load cargo away from the harbor into these standardized metal boxes, right? And then they are shipped to the harbor by truck or rail, and then loaded and unloaded off of ships using these massive cranes, right? Uh, the containerization is sort of developed in the late 50s, early 60s. Both U.S. as developed in the United States. Both major dock unions ultimately signed contracts to allow for the introduction of technology. I like to highlight that in most industries, in most countries, and most times in the world, employers do not ask workers what they think before introducing a technology. They just do it, right? The fact that they negotiated in these industries is evidence that these unions had power, right? And although to oversimplify matters, basically everyone knew that massive increase in productivity would result in fewer workers, probably, right? And so in exchange, there was a deal, a compromise, right? And the deal was, in the case of the US, no one would get fired or retrenched, but through attrition, basically, fewer workers over time would emerge, and we will pay you a lot more money, right? And so although dock workers got paid relatively well in the 1950s for manual laborers in the US, very well, they suddenly, starting in the 70s, really, you start to see dock workers in the US, and I should know other developed countries, industrial countries, where dock workers get paid really, really well. So in the United States, many dock workers earn more than 100,000 US dollars a year now, right? Which is a lot of money, more than many professors, right? But there's very few of them, and their productivity is fantastic. And the number of workers, even though they get paid well, is actually the percentage of labor costs is a fraction of what it used to be, right? Now in other countries, like South Africa, where dock workers didn't have formal power, although dock workers had some power, as I suggested, right? Like, but they weren't allowed to be in unions, although in the 70s they were organizing, right? When containers are formally introduced, of course, in the South African context, by the state, because it owned the transportation grid, right? And not just the airway, but the rail and harbor, right? Like containers were introduced simultaneously in all the major ports in 1977. And one day later, 50% of the workforce was retrenched, and workers received not a single penny more money, right? And so in my book, Dock Worker Power, I contrast that unions in these countries, but also where there were states that legalized and allowed workers to be more powerful, versus in South Africa, where workers were weak, even though workers are rising generally in the 70s, right? Like the same industry, radically different outcomes, right? Because different contexts, but also different amounts of power, I would suggest, right? And so that's sort of the big backstory, which I'm partially doing because no one's asking questions. But how does that affect us today? Dock workers still actually exist at this choke point, right? Like there are fewer of them, which in some ways is bad, right? Because we want more workers to have money, right? You could actually employ more workers and have fewer hours of work, right? And still people would be comfortable, but that's not the way capitalism works, right? Like I critique actually the union for basically not fighting for shorter work days to spread the work out more in the 60s and 70s, right? That could have been done, right? It still could be done actually, right? Why not work 4 hours a day and have twice the number of workers, right? Like, but whether you're working 8 hours a day, 10 hours a day, 4 hours a day, those workers still have power. And so we actually have seen in many ports, Barcelona, Genoa, two examples, but also San Francisco, Oakland sometimes, where these workers, if they're politicized, they can still stop work, right? Like, and so in some ways you could say they have more power, right? Like, which is why actually Donald Trump and employers hate dock worker unions, even though the East Coast Union flirts with the Donald Trump because they like his xenophobic politics. But you know, the dock workers globally, I would suggest, still have potential power to act, both for their own self-interest, because I agree with you 100% when you said earlier that unions' first goal is should be to improve the material conditions of workers in the union, right, with wages, hours, etc. But they can also do much more if they so wish, and sometimes have, right, and sometimes do now, right, and so even just last month, right, dockers in Tangier refused to work a Danish ship, Maersk, right, loaded with U.S. weapons for Israel, right. That was pretty unusual. It was, but you know, that just happened a few weeks ago, right? Swedish dockers have taken a stand saying they refuse to load military cargo, net period, to Israel. Spanish dockers have taken a similar stand. Some dockers in some Italian ports being important because Germany has no harbors. And so when Germany, which is the leading supplier of weapons other than the United States to Israel, they have to ship through Italy, right? Like, and so there are contemporary examples, right? These workers are often at great risk. The leader of the Swedish union was fired illegally for taking a stand that, from what I've read, was legal under Swedish labor law. But you know, so it is happening occasionally, right? It could happen more, right? And even though, in other words, technology has radically decreased the number of workers in this industry, it has not necessarily changed the political leanings of these unions.
Thanks, Peter. Is anyone inspired to ask a question? Peter, I'm going to throw one more at you, and then I think if nobody else asks something, and if anybody wants to just put up your hand, pop something in the question thing. But Peter, other than that, then I think maybe address that question. We can do a wrap up. And then I'll just say a few closing words to thank you after we've done that. I think maybe what you're pointing out here, which is crucial, it's partly about the balance of power on the docks and in other workplaces. It really depends how well organized workers are and what they're up against. So in South Africa in the 70s, you also, people often speak about the labor law simply as having a racially exclusive focus until, say, 1979 to 1981 with the Vion reforms. But they actually have massive sectoral exclusions. They exclude large parts of the state, a large number of what are deemed essential services. So the scope for organizing on the docks is pretty bad anyway at the time. And I think it's very, very useful to draw the comparison. So thank you very much for that. I think you're also pointing to the subjective factor. It's not simply a matter. Very often when people speak about union renewal, they simply map what unions can do, what sort of power they can leverage, structural, social, institutional, and organizational. Dr. Mateja was here early, Jerry Mateja, but he's left. But he makes this point in his PhD that it's not enough to look at simply what workers can do through a union, but to look at why they do what they do, why they realize some potentials and not others. And that's not simply an objective question. It's a question that goes down to what he described as, drawing on Richard Hyman, union identity that's shaped over time. I think your other point, and this is where I'll seek into a question, is that no matter what the technology you have to have workers. So even if we're talking about the cranes, somebody has to build the cranes. If you're talking about AI, somebody has to run the power stations that feed the AI. Somebody has to program the stuff. Somebody has to make the boards that go into the laptops, that go into the systems and the networks. So we always got that. So my question here is, people are often very pessimistic about the future of labor. Could you maybe just reflect a bit on why it's important to look at these earlier histories and to take them seriously rather than see them as, the territory of professors who like things that happened 60 years ago, or matters simply of antiquarian interest, like, oh my goodness, that was very nice and quite, Why is it important to look at this stuff? As you said, we like labor history, but maybe make the case.
Of course. Well, 60 years ago is actually not very long, right? I'm almost 60 myself, right? And so, which means that my parents were much older than that. And so, what is a long time is, of course, a matter of opinion, right? But 60 years is really within the lifetime of a great many people. And if not many people, it's in the lifetime of their parents, right? And so we're not talking about ancient history. I'm always deeply impressed with people who are interested in what I consider ancient history, whether it's the 15th century or the 1st century or even earlier times. I'm always like, wow, that's incredible. I could be totally wrong, but I often think of what I do as essentially current events, right? And in Europe, which is much older in its sort of histories than the United States, contemporary history is sometimes a term used to describe 20th century history, right? Which I remember being shocked at when I heard that was the case. So one, it's not that long ago, right? Two, everything about the present is explained by what happened before, right? In the same way that I am who I am because of my parents and who came before me, so too societies in the world, right? And so I appreciate that many people don't think that history matters. I'm a teacher of young people, and so I get this on a regular basis. But I would suggest when people actually think about it for more than just 5 seconds, it becomes pretty obvious that why is South Africa the way it is? It's because of what happened before, right? And not 300 years before, maybe, but 50 years before, yeah, right? As for the future of labor, right? I don't know what the future of labor is. But I could say that why do we study the past? One of the reasons isn't just to understand who I am as a person or who we are as a society and a world, right? It's because it can be a so-called usable history, right? That we could take lessons from the past. Now, I appreciate that many of us fail to heed the lessons that I think are worth heeding, right? But in the 1930s, there was a terrible depression in the United States of America. Workers were in a really bad situation. Unemployment was at its highest ever. Among Black people, it was probably 50%. Among nationwide, it was 25, 30, 35%. those are the conditions that you would suspect never would result in the birth of a union movement, let alone a powerful, radical one. In other words, if they could do it in times that were really against workers, we could do it, right? And not that workers are in a great position now, far from it, but in the United States, and I would say in many countries, I appreciate not South Africa, unemployment is actually very low, right? Like in the US, unemployment is under 4%, right? And so like that suggests, now that's one of the reasons in the recent past that actually wages have gone up when you adjust for inflation, right? Labor competition isn't just among workers, employers are competing for labor. Right. That's of course why many employers want to introduce new technologies to replace workers. Right. But I would say that studying labor history is a recipe for understanding why, in fact, today is quite possible to organize unions. Because in many countries, but in the United States, my home country and the one I know best, 70% of Americans want to be in a union and are pro-union, but only 10% are. Where is the gap? That's because of actually the conditions that employers in the state have created, really the state on behalf of employers, to make it nearly impossible to organize unions, right? But despite that, many people are increasingly pro-union, right? So these are the sorts of questions I think that you raise that are relevant, so that we can hopefully energize people to engage in activism, which is much harder than just watching TV, right? But is necessary if we want to improve our world, right? And so I'm a believer, right? I'm a member of a union too, and I get paid more than I would if I wasn't in a union, right? And so just for my self-interest, right? These are the sort of ways I try to connect past and present that might be of convincing, to other people besides myself.
All right. Thanks very much, Peter. I saw in the comments some nice words from Sandisa Mzindana, who's a master's student at Fort Hare. Very interested in reading more material on these topics, and he said your stuff is very accessible. And I'm going to put him in touch with you. He wants recommended texts. Peter, thank you again for making the time. Unfortunately, we weren't able to host you when you were in our neck of the woods, but I think this has reached a lot of people. We will also be recording. We have recorded this, we'll edit, we'll put it out, we'll reach more people that way. Again, it's an absolute pleasure to host you as the Neil Agate Labour Studies Unit. For anyone who's not familiar with us, you can find information about us in the adverts that came out for this. But we're keen on all things labor. We're non-sectarian. We're pluralist. We don't, let's say, take sides in the splits in the labor movement. I think, generally speaking, we are, however, sympathetic to the labor movement. So anyone who's interested in following things around NOLSU, just pop your name in the chat before you forget. Anybody else who wants to be put in direct touch with Peter, pop your name in the list, and I'm sure he's a very generous and thoughtful fellow, and I'm sure he will get back to you as soon as possible. Thanks, everybody. Without further ado, thanks very much, Peter. Let's give him a round of virtual applause.